Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. We are going to start talking about Miami and the ACC situation. Their AD had some very interesting comments about the Clemson and Florida State lawsuits that I want to jump into. Then we have an NFL draft update. McCarthy has gotten a lot of buzz, possibly going number 2 overall to the Commanders, so I want to break down all of that for y'all. And then we're going to get into some breakout players for 2024. This has become a very much recurring segment on this program, and we are up to part 4 on the defensive side of the ball. I think we're going to tap out about part 5 of either side of the ball, so nearing the end of this series, but definitely still have some more guys to get to. And then we have a Top 10 Tuesday, and I think it's a really good one today. Definitely a very contentious one. I have the best position rooms in the country for you all today. Definitely a very, very hard list to put together, but I think I have a pretty good 10, but I'm sure there will be people that disagree with me. But let's start with this. I just want to remind you all before we get going here, the best way for you all to see your questions or comments on the screen is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to see your question on the screen. You get to have a fun little back and forth here, possibly bring up something that we can kind of talk about. So definitely use gsmcpodcast.net if you have any of those questions. But let's jump right in. There has been so much happening around the ACC in particular. Those lawsuits are starting to pile up around the ACC headquarters, and there have been a lot of teams on the outside that we have been kind of watching. Obviously, Clemson and Florida State have jumped to the front lines. They have been the teams that we have already filed lawsuits against the ACC and have had counter lawsuits filed against them. So those are the two teams already involved, and everyone was kind of just waiting for who the next team might be. And Miami tended to be the team that everyone brought up, including myself. I thought they would be the next to jump on board, then possibly Virginia or North Carolina after them. But it looks like that might not happen. Their AD, Dan Radakovich, had a very interesting conversation on 560 AM down in Miami last week, where he was talking about just where they sit with the conference and his reaction to all of the new lawsuits and everything that has started to come out. So he essentially said they are very solid with the ACC. In fact, I have a quote here. He says, here at the University of here at the University of Miami, we are incredibly solid with the ACC. It's a great conference, provides a great structure and access to the college football playoff, which is very, very important. We are very proud to be a part of that and a leading brand within the ACC, and will continue to be a part of it. So if you take that at face value, it looks like they are staying put, at least for the time being. And I think there's obviously a lot of question of when all this is going to start happening, because there's been talks for, I think, about 6 months now since Florida State has started this whole craziness around the ACC with filing the first lawsuit. There was some question of how quickly can all this happen, how quickly everything can, get down the road, and maybe Clemson and Florida State can leave the conference. And he went back to not the most recent, but one of the more recent conference realignment eras was Texas and OU going to the SEC, and they wanted out a little bit earlier than they were able to get out, so they had to wait a little bit and be able to afford the buyout to get out of that conference. So there's definitely some idea, and it seems like Dan Radakovich shares this, that it's going to take some time for Clemson and Florida State to pull this off, partly because that number is just so exorbitant. It's somewhere, I think the total would be somewhere around $700 million if they were to get out this year. So that doesn't make a lot of financial sense at the moment. So I think it's very possible that we see them wait a couple of years and kind of deal with the ACC for the time being and work out for the next couple of years in the ACC, but then eventually come back to this and move on. But I think there's a lot of different things happening here, and I think a lot of people are wondering how much of a leg do these two teams in particular, and any teams that join after them, how much of a leg do they really have to stand on in terms of, do they really have an argument to leave? Do they really have something firm to stand on to make that argument? And I think the best way to do that is go into the TV deals, right? That's where a lot of this money comes from for these conferences, for these teams. That's where a lot of the, money is made in college football now. And the ACC is sitting somewhere around 17 million per team. They have 14 teams right now. I think that number will probably start to go up, which we'll talk about here in a second. But they have about 17 million. The SEC is closer to like 40 million, so almost or more than double what the ACC is making. Then you have the Big Ten around 31 million for their contract. So there's very obviously considerable gap between these two big powerhouses that we've talked about so much in the SEC and the Big Ten and everyone else, especially the ACC. So there's an argument to be made. There's no two ways about that. I think Clemson and Florida State are very obviously looking at this. They see what's going on in the sport of college football. They see that the ACC has almost kind of resigned themselves to a third-tier conference with those college football playoff distribution deal that came out. They pretty much said out in front of everyone that they are a third-tier conference and they are going to stay that way, at least for the time being. So that obviously is going to frustrate some people, especially when you have a media deal that has been set up so long ago and has not kept up with the times and is well behind where the Big Ten and the SEC are currently. So it's definitely a good argument by Clemson and Florida State, and I believe they're going to be successful in doing this. I think I talked about it really early on in this process once Florida State joined and once Clemson joined even more. This idea that in college football, it's all about, who has the most money, who has the most ability to make things happen. And when enough people are converged on a certain idea, those things tend to happen, especially when those people have a little bit of money at their disposal. So Florida State and Clemson, they're pretty much, at some point in the future, they will be out of the conference. The question now becomes who's going to join them and how long does that take? Because as Radakovich said earlier, there is very little chance that they can afford what they're going to have to afford if they want to leave ASAP. So it could be a Texas OU situation where you let a couple of years pass, you let that number come down a little bit, and then you strike when the time is right. So it'll all be very interesting to see how all of this is going to go down, because the ACC obviously is not hoping for anyone else to join this. I think they very, very much want this to be the only two teams that join these lawsuits. They very much want to keep everything intact. If you lose Clemson and Florida State, that's obviously a terrible loss, but you still have a great leg to stand on. You still have a ton of teams in that conference that hold weight in a number of different sports. So if it's just Clemson and Florida State, I think the ACC is okay. I tend to believe it's not going to be Clemson and Florida State, but Dan Radakovich has made it very clear that it's going to take a little bit of time, maybe a little bit more time than Florida State and Clemson fans would like, and that obviously puts off the idea of two major conferences, because that's where I think a lot of us feel like we're heading, where the ACC or the SEC and the Big Ten are sitting so far above everyone that they're essentially the NFC and the AFC of college football, right? So I think with Clemson and Florida State, that's obviously going to be the first domino to fall. And all of this craziness that is going to be happening over the next, year, 2 years, whatever it is, to get that number down to where Clemson and Florida State feel comfortable, and whoever else joins these lawsuits feel comfortable. But I think the ACC is in a position where they're essentially in damage control, as we've talked about a number of times on here, and they need to make sure that as many people don't join these lawsuits as possible, especially under the way that Florida State and Clemson did it, where Florida State was attacking from one angle, Clemson attacked from a totally different angle. So there's no real ability for the ACC to tie those two together, to use the same arguments for those two deals, and it makes it a lot tougher to deal with those. Obviously, you want to be able to group these as best you can and be able to create arguments that apply to as many different cases as possible. But Florida State and Clemson made that really tough on them by attacking from two different angles. And I think that's very likely what the next team will do. Whether that's Miami, it doesn't seem like it's going to be Miami for the time being, which is great news for the ACC because everyone was pointing to them to be the next one. But I think in the grand scheme of things, the ACC is very much locked in on one school. They're locked in on one team. They're locked in on one entity, and that is in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I think we've talked about conference realignment so much over the last couple of years, and especially over the last little bit on this show, just talking about the ACC's future and kind of what's going to happen with it. And obviously, Clemson and Florida State are the biggest football programs in that conference. They hold the most weight in college football. They have the most history, national championships, all of that type of stuff. Miami right behind them in that respect. So there are tons of ability within those football programs. But when you talk about conference realignment, you got to talk about a lot more than football. You have to be able to expand that debate a little bit and think about the athletic department as a whole. And I'll be totally honest, there's not an ACC athletic department that comes really close to North Carolina in terms of being as complete and as well-rounded of a athletic department as there is in the country. I mean, they have so much ability. Obviously, the basketball program is the one that sets the pace. The football program, since Mac Brown has gotten there, has not necessarily reached the heights they wanted to, but still a 9 or 8 win team every single year, right in the mix for the ACC. So there's still some great stuff there. The Olympic sports are really remarkable there. Men's soccer is out of this world as well as women's. So there is tons to like about this North Carolina product. I think they are the team in all of this, frankly, whether you include Clemson or Florida State or anyone. I think they are the team that the SEC and the Big Ten want the most. I think they're the one that they're looking at and kind of licking their chops, really, really wanting them to join this fight because, as we've talked about a couple of different times, one of the biggest things in these court filings and one of the biggest things that will define a lot of this in the next probably couple of months is when we'll figure out all of this, is where these are going to be tried. Obviously, Florida State is trying to get theirs tried in Florida, while the ACC is trying to counter in North Carolina where their headquarters are. Same thing with Clemson. They want it in South Carolina. ACC wants it in North Carolina, and that holds a lot of weight. As we know, there are a ton of Florida State fans in Florida. There are a ton of Clemson fans in South Carolina. So if you're the ACC, you'd like to avoid that as much as possible. But if North Carolina jumps into the fray, all home court advantage in terms of having North Carolina as a home base is gone because North Carolina is a bigger deal in North Carolina than the ACC, let's be honest. So it would be very interesting if North Carolina was to jump in. I think they are the school that not only will make this a big-time story, but will really get the wheels churning in terms of getting this stuff moving forward because I know for a fact the SEC is looking at them as someone they would love to add. The Big Ten, they would fit incredibly well with the academics that they have over there. And then once North Carolina joins, I think there will be a lot more teams across the league that will be much more comfortable joining the fray because if North Carolina does something, then the ACC is going to listen, and the ACC is going to be under a really, really tough position going forward. So I think if North Carolina joins, then Miami, Dan Radakovich and Miami might change their tone a little bit and might join the party. I think Virginia is right behind them, and then a lot of stuff happens very quickly for the ACC. So I think while they might be safe from Miami for the time being, it looks like Dan Radakovich is plenty happy with what the ACC is doing right now and how they're handling all this. I think North Carolina is the one where if they jump in, the ACC's fate is becoming a little bit more real and a little bit coming a little bit quicker than I think they would have hoped. But at the end of the day, as of right now, they have 2 teams to deal with. I think they are trying to focus on those 2 teams as much as possible, but there are teams in the brush that are watching this very, very intently, and if Miami or especially North Carolina jump in, it could get very sketchy for the ACC very quickly. But we will definitely keep you updated with all the happenings there. I'm sure this month and the following month will be huge for this court cases, for figuring out what the future of the ACC really looks like in terms of who's leaving exactly, how many teams are leaving, who they need to backfill with, because a lot of that stuff needs to happen pretty quickly. So I think we'll get answers very quickly. We will keep you updated as those answers come in. But we're going to take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the NFL draft, have a little update for you guys. Obviously, the big news is J.J. McCarthy possibly going number 2 overall to the Commanders. So we will break down what I think about that and all of the new news around the draft right after this.